Welcome to this session of teleconferencing for students of bachelor's degree program, especially those who have opted for political science. Today's topic for discussion is state and globalization. This is a topic which has been taken from the course material EPS 11, which is entitled Political Ideas and Ideologies. This is from block 8. From this is our first unit, and let me say that though it is meant for political science students opting for other social science courses may also be interested in this topic, given the importance of the globalization phenomena in the country and worldwide. Let me briefly give you why the course designing team has identified this chapter as a component of political ideas and ideologies. There are two reasons for this. One is globalization is no longer an academic debate. It has now spilled into the streets. Second reason is that globalization is a phenomena in which you are an active participant. Let me briefly explain these two reasons why the committee felt that this unit should be a part of the course on political ideas and ideologies. As I said, it was an academic debate for a long time whether there's been globalization, and this debate dominated the 1980s. But in the 1990s, all the skepticism about globalization has vanished, and globalization has become a political, has assumed a political overtones, and it has spilled into the streets. Today, instead of having skeptics about who argue whether there is globalization at all, we have those who are highly critical of the globalization process. So, this is one reason why you should be interested in this topic. The second reason is simply that you yourself are all part of the globalization process. Because generally there is a tendency to think of globalization as some external thing, as an external force in which some decisions are taken elsewhere and these impinge on you. But globalization is not as simple as that. As you are listening to us, you are actually participating in globalization. Whenever you open the internet site to access the IGNOU material, you are participating in the globalization process, because this telecast, as well as the IGNOU's website, is not restricted to the students of political science and students of IGNOU only. It is accessible worldwide, and the telecast is also 1/3 of the globe is right now able to access this telecast. So all of you who are receiving this, in fact, are participating in the globalization process. Given this preliminary introduction, I want to say that we have today with us in the studio Dr. Anurag Joshi, who is my colleague, to discuss on this topic. Dr. Anurag, let me begin by asking you to clarify the concepts of globalism and globalization. What exactly is the distinction?
Thank you, Dr. Vijay Shekhar Reddy. Before I get on to the finer nuances, I would like to mention that the theme that we have chosen, that is state and globalization, this theme is, of course, my colleague Dr. Vijay Shekhar Reddy has pointed out, it's not exclusive only to this particular course, that is EPS 11, which goes by the title of Political Ideas and Ideologies. In fact, those of you who are enrolled for IGNOU's bachelor's degree program, as well as now you must be knowing we have the master's program, you will find that the theme of globalization is running across a lot of our courses, both at the bachelor's level as well as the master's level. This fact itself should indicate to you the importance of this topic. Now, coming to, as it has been told to you, globalization is a phenomena which is very much in now. We are all part of a globalized world or a globalizing world. Now, in the when one is talking of the specifics of the discipline, as well as when one talks generally, often people use certain terms which are interchangeable, implying that they mean one and the same thing, but it's not actually so. At least those who are specialists, they should be able to deliberate on the finer nuances, and that is where we come to this globalization versus globalism. Now, to put it simply, globalization is basically a process. Globalism is an ideological framework which stands for certain ideas or values which are to be brought about by the process of globalization. So globalism is a framework, it's an ideological framework or a schematic framework or an explanatory framework, whereas globalization is the process which facilitates the ideas and the values which are incorporated in this ideology. At this moment I would like to say this much only.
Okay, then in other words, globalization is a process. It is a process of interdependence, and that interdependence is largely seen as economic interdependence, but it is not necessarily confined to economic domain. We will see that globalization has several other aspects and dimensions. Apart from the economic dimension, the interdependence is reflected in politics, in culture, and in technological aspects. Let us briefly discuss some of the key aspects of economic globalization, or by which globalization is generally understood. One of the important features of this interdependence is the movement of goods and services on the one hand, then the movement of capital, and finally the movement of people themselves. These three are the key components of the ongoing globalization process, which is bringing greater interdependence between different regions and countries of the globe. Anurag, would you like to elaborate on this?
Yes, Vijay, when we are actually talking of, like one says that there are dimensions of globalization which you have pointed out, for instance, say economic, social, political, cultural, but it is good to note that when one talks of globalization, or when we go back into the emergence of the idea of globalization, the concept of globalization, now we all use this term in our day-to-day lives. It has become almost as common as, say, the term corruption, if one is to give an example. So if we go back into the genesis of this term globalization, basically it you will understand or gather that it's related to the economic dimension or to the field of economics, and there is a background to it. In fact, one understanding or interpretation of globalization is that globalization is the spread of liberalization on a global scale. So now the question will come then, what is liberalization? So we have to actually now come to what is liberalization. Liberalization again, its origins is from the sphere of economics. When one talks of liberalization, basically what one meant was, and how it came about was that the so, the pattern of the mixed economy which our country has followed, for which India has followed, for instance, after independence, or where you have what is called the socialistic pattern of economy, basically a pattern where the state had an overwhelming presence in the economic aspect. So the idea of liberalization was, and is, I mean, in its original form was that the presence of the state should be reduced in the economic sphere, in putting it in other words, the state may maintain its presence only in what are the vital or the core sectors of the economy, and the non-vital sectors the state should gradually recede, withdraw, or maybe even altogether move away. So the idea of liberalization was and is that the structures, the overwhelming presence of the state in the economic domain. For instance, in the case of India, following independence, we decided to follow the concept of mixed economy, where you would have a private sector which we all know operates largely on the profit motive. You would be having a public sector where the government would have a major role, and you would have a mixed sector, joint sector, where the private sector and the public sector would cooperate with each other. Now, as the Indian economic system evolved over a period of time, that is, our founders of our constitution, our first Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and others, they were highly influenced by the Soviet model of development, or the model being practiced by the erstwhile USSR, and the ethos was that the state should have an overarching presence in the economic sphere as well as elsewhere. Now, how did this idea of liberalization come up in India or elsewhere? You see, if you take India, the socialist pattern of economy that was being followed, it gradually degenerated into what is popularly known as the license permit quota Raj, or the Babu Neta and the politician syndrome. That is, though India was supposed to be a welfare state following a socialist pattern of economy, if not in a exactly pure form, but still some variant of it, but the benefits of development, they were not percolating to the beneficiaries for whom it was meant. And so this idea came that it would be better if the presence of the state is, if not altogether done away with, it should be reduced in the economic sphere. That is, licensing should be made easy, or it should be abolished. People should be, entrepreneurs should be facilitated in setting up industrial units, and so forth. So when we are talking of globalization, always one has to remember that basically it has to be spoken of in terms of liberalization. You cannot understand globalization without liberalization. Liberalization, as I have told you, had an economic component which was freeing the economy from the presence of the state, and over a period of time it acquired other dimensions in the field of culture, society, politics, etc.
That was a very good analysis with a case of India. I mean, how the process of economic integration with the global economy took place as far as the Indian case is concerned. As my colleague has pointed out, the phenomena of globalization is something which has taken off in the last 2 decades, but though the demand for liberalization has been there for quite some time. Like the post-Cold War period, it has become very the interdependence has become intense and also dynamic, and it has become more comprehensive, involving almost all the countries of the globe. Whereas in the past, that is, if we take the international economic order that was established after the Second World War, it at that time the demand was to gradually reduce the tariff barriers between the countries. Many countries like India, especially those developing countries which wanted to protect and strengthen their own technological and industrial capabilities, decided to keep away from the world economic order, and at least they restricted their economies' access to the external international order. But all this changed in the 1990s. Many countries have joined the international economic order by accepting the programs of liberalization and privatization. Why did this happen? There are two reasons for this. Apart from the fact that the economic integration gives benefits, which as Dr. Joshi has analyzed, there were two other reasons. One was the technological revolution in the field of communications and transportation. The speed with which ideas and goods could be transferred multiplied phenomenally since the 60s, especially with the coming of the space age. Another aspect which contributed to the speeding of the economic interdependence and integration with the global economic order is the fact that many countries at the end of the Cold War felt the loss of the command economy system. The legitimacy of that command economy seemed to have weakened. It is as a result of this that many countries, especially in the early 90s, joined the international economic order. So with this, the debate on globalization has been shifted from whether there was globalization or not, because there were some skeptics who used to say that globalization, after all, has been there even in the late 19th century. There was a migration going on in the late 19th century. There has been a transfer of capital across the countries. There has been transfer of goods and services happening then. The only thing is it has been disrupted by the First World War and the Second World War, and now that it is coming back again. So this globalization phenomena is nothing new. It is something which has been happening. But that is not exactly the position which we should be taking, because globalization is a historical phenomena coming now at a stage when there has been a greater integration of the countries with the international economy, when there is a technological revolution in the field of transportation and communications, at a time when the world has become unipolar and the agenda, the ideas of the liberal world have gained wider acceptance. Now, having understood the broad contours of the economic aspects of globalization, let us shift to political globalization. Dr. Anurag, what do you have to say on political aspects of globalization?
Economic aspect, I think we have covered. Now, as we mentioned, globalization has other dimensions, for instance, political, cultural, etc. When we talk of the political dimension or the political aspect of globalization, now, as it has been pointed out, some idea you would have got when we were dealing with the emergence of liberalization on a global scale. Now, the political dimension of globalization basically concerns itself with establishment of a particular, I may use the term particular political type in terms of a framework of governance. And like for instance, the critics of globalization point out that politically the agenda of globalization is to impose a sort of a capitalist development-led democracy along the lines of USA all over the world. Politically, when we are talking of globalization, then these ideas come into the picture, say efficiency, governance, human rights, then democracy. It can be presidential or parliamentary, but it has to be a democracy based on certain recognizable features of democracy, such as universal adult franchise, voting rights, right to run for public office, etc. Basically, and also political globalization also means that you establish a sort of, if one may use the term, a sort of world government which is conducive to the economic aspect of globalization. That, for instance, world government may not be a very good terminology, but you can understand in this way, say establishment of supra national organizations or agencies. For instance, you have say the WTO, World Trade Organization, or you have the GATT, and you have the IMF, the World Bank. The idea is that you have a political climate or political culture based, as I've told you, the inclusive of human rights, adult franchise, political liberalism, that also facilitates the economic aspect of liberalization. That is what one can talk of when one is talking of political globalization.
So, in other words, political globalization is evident from the fact that states have to respond to new rules, they have to establish new rules, they have to even establish new institutions, which has taken place, as my colleague has told you. Several new international organizations like the WTO have come into being to deal with the political aspects. Political aspects are also reflected in the social activism and in the activities of non-governmental organizations, which have grown in global scale. In fact, these are the two dimensions which one can identify as the political aspects of globalization. Now, coming to the cultural aspects of globalization, this is very much reflected in the free flow of ideas and fashions through trade, media, and through the movement of people. The result is that a commodity which is or a brand which was available in one corner of the world is today available in exactly diametrically opposite part of the globe in the same quality. In the same quality, and many brands have become international brands. That is, they are no longer favorites in one country, but favorites in several countries of the globe. This would be the cultural dimension of globalization. Finally, there is also the technological aspect of globalization. Would you like to elaborate on the technological aspects?
Technological aspect, well, you all know of the internet and the information technology revolution. As my colleague Dr. Vijay Shekhar Reddy pointed out at the beginning of this presentation, we are all, even as we are sitting in this studio and talking, we are part of the globalized world through the revolutionary changes that have taken place in the world of communications. You have now the World Wide Web, WW, where you are accessible to all and all are accessible to you. The flow of ideas, the transmission of values is instantaneous. So the technological globalization basically would mean coming into being of, I would say, information technology that has facilitated the other aspects of globalization, especially the cultural aspect. For instance, if you are talking of the mass media now, say if there are certain music channels which have, which unite people across the world. For instance, MTV, it is a very pertinent cultural symbol of globalization. It has revolutionized genres of music across countries of the world, a single musical channel. So technology is, the instrumentalities, the WW, the computers and all the satellites, they have, that is what one can speak of when one is talking of the technological aspect of globalization.
Now, having delineated some of the aspects of globalization, that is the economic, political, cultural and technological, it is very clear that globalization has two sides. One is that the process is occurring not only from the above but also from the below. When I say the process is occurring from the above, I mean that it is the actions of the national governments, the national policies of deregulation, privatization and liberalization that the nation states are adopting, as well as the activities of the multinational corporations and international organizations that are shaping the process of globalization. And when I say the globalization process is also from the below, I mean that there are large number of non-governmental organizations and social activists who are increasingly becoming global in their network and who are influencing and shaping the globalization process. Even to the extent that even the anti-globalization movement that is we have witnessed since the 90s, he is itself adopting global technologies and strategies to achieve its goal. Now, having said this, let us turn to what exactly is this and the aims of this anti-globalization movement that has been on since the 1990s. Would you like to say something about this?
Globalize, as I think I pointed out and my colleague also pointed out, globalization has its critics, and the criticism of globalization is directed against its different dimensions. For instance, if one is talking of the economic field, then the main charge that comes up is that the globalizing economy or globalized economies, the benefits of development are not really percolating to the grassroots. Or to put it alternatively, the critics of globalization say that it is actually the middle class, and that also the middle and the upper middle class, which is really benefiting from globalization. It is not trickled down to those who constitute the poor of a country. For instance, if you take India, then it would be that the Indian middle class has prospered, but the poor's lives have not changed significantly. Then politically, as I said, the charge is that in the name of globalization, the only superpower of the world, that is the United States of America, it wants to impose its biased view of, say for instance, human rights on other countries. For instance, this becomes very relevant when one talks of labor laws, etc. For instance, you have issues like the West view of the practice of human rights in People's Republic of China, for instance. It is a very controversial area, but all this comes up. Culturally, as I have told you, basically the criticism is that under the garb or in the name of globalization, the values of the West, and that also not West represented uniformly. For instance, not those, not so much say Western Europe, but again like American culture. So when one is talking of when one is critiquing globalization from the cultural viewpoint, then the charge is that the attempt is made to impose American culture all over the world. That is a homogenized. The critics of globalization accuse its propagators of homogenizing cultural values in a way which has been done in the past, say by the fascists in certain countries of the world, or the Nazis, for instance. So these are the basic points of criticism leveled against globalization. Vijay, I think now it will be better we can summarize a bit, because I think we have about 3-4 minutes left.
No, I
Overview
think I
sort
would
of.
like to say that, repeat some of the important aspects you brought out, like that anti-globalization movement, as you said, is not simply against globalization per se. It is critiquing certain aspects, it is against certain aspects or forms of globalization. As you said, some of them see it as an imperialistic design where only the rich countries are benefiting. Others see it as it as a corporatist agenda where it is the multinational corporations and which are benefiting at the cost of individual freedom. It is for their profits. They are even prepared to sacrifice their constrain the freedoms of the individuals. And finally, the critique against globalization also comes from those who are advocates of the strong state. They say that the role of the state is getting diminished with the emergence of new actors and with the greater interdependence that is leading to emergence of new international organizations, and even the linkages that are emerging between many non-governmental organizations spread across the globe. Now, Anurag, what are the key points that a student should keep in mind as the concluding part of this?
State and globalization, one point you have to keep in mind is that when one talks of state and globalization, always the question of the sovereignty of the state will come up. That you will have to keep in mind how sovereign the state is. Sovereign, you know, is internal and external supremacy of the state. Then you will have to keep in mind the various dimensions of globalization which we have touched upon, that is the economic, the political, the social, the cultural. You will have to keep in mind the critique of globalization. What are the points of criticism leveled against it? You should also be able to distinguish it from its terms which do not mean the same thing but sound similar, for instance, which we touched on in a presentation, that is globalization and globalism. And then of course you can keep in mind certain case studies. For instance, you can discuss the experience of India in the last 15 or 20 years, for instance, after the introduction of economic reforms. And I think if you keep all this in mind, you would be doing justice to the topic. That is all.
Yeah. If there are any questions from the students who are watching this program, they are welcome. Otherwise, we will interact again in the next session when we meet on the 17th of this month. Thank you very much.